Hey team, and welcome to another video in the Astrological Magical Elections video series. Today we're going to talk about the magical electional opportunities that are going to be available to us between the Taurus New Moon on May 11th until our Sagittarius Lunar Eclipse on May 26th. So there's a lot of opportunities in this 2-week period. It's a waxing moon. There's a lot of good electional opportunities for growth here, which is really great. But because there are so many opportunities and because there's a lot of overlap between my 3 locations that I cover, we're going to do this video a little bit differently from my normal kind of 3 location framework, talking about elections in North America and then Western Europe and then Australia. Today, we're going to do kind of old school back before I settled in that framework, and we're going to talk about each opportunity chronologically, and then kind of talk about the differences in the elections between locations to where it's applicable. So to make that a little bit easier to navigate for individuals who prefer to only watch the sections of the video for their location to see what opportunities are relevant to them, which is totally fine. In the description, what we're going to do is we're going to put timestamps for each of the charts, and then along with that, put what areas of the world that election or that opportunity, that talismanic opportunity, is available for. So you can just kind of flip through what's available for your location. So we're just going to go ahead and dive right into it with that out of the way. And our first electional opportunity is actually going to be one for a Jupiter planetary talisman. And this is sort of like our immediate, well, I guess to go back a second, this is an election that I've kind of had my eye on for a minute, because it may be, depending on whether or not you like it, our first opportunity for a Jupiter in Pisces talisman in this Jupiter cycle. So that's kind of cool. And it happens almost immediately after Jupiter moves into Pisces. But there are some kind of things in the election that might make it not as ideal for people. So, you may choose to skip it and wait until a little bit later Jupiter and Pisces opportunity. That's totally fine. But if you kind of feel like you're in need for a Jupiter and Pisces talisman, or you maybe want to do like a more temporary Jupiter and Pisces talisman to kind of get a feel for it, like maybe if your Jupiter's condition is a little bit more iffy in chart, like you're not sure exactly if it is more of a hindrance or more of a boon to you, this might be a good way to kind of test the waters. And then kind of come back later on, when you've kind of figured it out, whether or not it's something that you want to pursue or not, to make a more standard or a more permanent talisman. That's totally fine too, and this might be a good election for that because it is a little bit iffy in some regards. Well, I guess really in one major regard. So to kind of give my normal spiel on planetary talismans, of course, I do not recommend individuals who have the planet debilitated in their natal chart to immediately jump into talismanic ritual work with this planet. So if you're an individual whose natal Jupiter is kind of busted up, and you know for a fact that the areas of life that are associated with Jupiter are more difficult for you, or they tend to manifest, or you experience them as more areas of difficulty or hindrance or sadness or things like that, then it's probably not a good idea to immediately jump into getting a talisman for Jupiter, because that's going to exacerbate or increase the symptoms of a lot of the problems that you're already facing. And that's not what you want. You want to overcome them. You want to transmute them into something that is more positive. And for this, I recommend so much Jupiter charity or Jupiter remedial work, primarily in the form of charity, but other things as well, to really kind of increase and transform that relationship before moving into a talismanic relationship with. So that's that. But for individuals who have Jupiter more well placed and who tend to get more positive things out of Jupiter, be my guest. So taking a look at our elections, the first election here is in the North America version, and this is on May 14th at around 1:36 a.m. And this is almost immediately after Jupiter has moved into Pisces. Jupiter moved into Pisces just a few hours before this chart is set. And in this chart, it is the hour of Jupiter. No, I'm sorry. And in this chart, it is the day of Jupiter after midnight, but before sunrise on a Thursday is the day of Jupiter, of course. Still, and we have Pisces rising with Jupiter on the ascendant here, which is really great. At the same time, the moon is applying a trine to Jupiter here. So kind of the more iffy thing to consider about this chart is, of course, the relationship between Jupiter and the moon. She is there. They have an out of trine sign. They have an out of sign trine. When the moon moves into Cancer, the trine will be more whole sign trine, more strong. But here they're separated by about 9 degrees, but that is applying. So kind of depending on how you feel about out of sign aspects, or whether or not you feel like 9 degrees is kind of big for a moon Jupiter aspect, I think it's fine. that will kind of change your attitude about whether or not this is an election that you want to move forward with. Keep in mind also the nodes are very angular at this time, which might not be something that you're comfortable with. But Saturn is cadent in this chart. Mars is not afflicting the moon or Jupiter at this time. So all in all, it's pretty, it checks all the boxes of what we want in a planetary talismanic election. The planet is angular. The planet is strong in a sign of domicile or exaltation. It's the planet's day or hour, and the moon is applying an aspect to that planet immediately. And those things are there, but I guess you could put an asterisk on the moon applying to the planet immediately, because is the moon applying out of sign something that you consider to be immediate, and is 9 degrees something you consider to be immediate, and that is of course kind of up to you at that time to decide. The selection for Western Europe is very similar here for May 14th at around 2:25 a.m. And it's also Jupiter's day after midnight on a Friday, but before sunrise on Friday is still Jupiter's day. Very, very similar. Jupiter is on the ascendant in Pisces. The moon is applying a trine to Jupiter. Saturn and Mars are still out of the way. The nodes are less angular in this chart, or at least for the location that I have it set for. That might not be exactly right for once you fine tune it for your own location. But as you can see, the moon Jupiter trine is now larger. It's still out of sign, but now it's about 12 degrees apart. So that might be where we kind of start to consider this as not being an immediate application. But that is the moon's next application is still this trine with Jupiter. So for those in Western Europe, you kind of have a little bit more of a separated moon trine aspect here. But it's still there, and of course, like I said, kind of up to you to decide whether or not it's something worth pursuing, or kind of how much effort to put into that pursuit if you do decide to move forward with it. And then the Australian version of this chart is, I think, a little bit better than the other two versions, just because the aspect is a bit closer. But this occurs on May 15th at around 12:30 at 12:22 a.m. And here we have changed kind of our situation. Now it's a Friday. It's the day of Venus. Because now it's after midnight on a Saturday morning, technically. But it's the hour of Jupiter at this time. So we've changed out the day like we had in the Western Europe and the North American charts now for the Jupiter hour. But Jupiter is still angular in Pisces on the ascendant here. And we still have this trine, this out of sign trine to the moon in Gemini. The moon will, of course, complete this application immediately after she moves into Cancer. But as you can see with this version of the chart, the moon is a bit closer to the completion of this aspect. Now it's only about 6 degrees separated, where it was 9 and 12 in North American and Western European charts. So Australia kind of has a tighter connection here between the moon and Jupiter. So for them, it may be worth exploring a little bit more. The nodes are still angular here in the 10th and 4th houses, not exactly conjoined the midheaven or the IC like they were in the North American chart. So that might give you a little bit more relief. But if you're not too happy with the nodes still being that angular, then that's kind of all we have right now for this opportunity. So our second electional opportunity is going to be just a few hours later, and this is going to be for a 7th Lunar Mansion talisman. So the 7th Lunar Mansion is actually a really great one of my probably top 5, and this mansion is for a kind of quote, the acquisition of all good things. Very similar in spirit to the 3rd Lunar Mansion, which tends to be a bit more feminine in this regard, but the 7th Lunar Mansion is kind of like her spear counterpart, kind of able to do somewhat similar things. And so because we're told that this mansion is for the acquisition of all good things, its powers are very broad to bring about, positive developments into our lives. So I really recommend diving into this whenever we have a really good chart for it. As with the waxing moon, we're kind of in that acquisition, that gaining. And then we want to, of course, bring in a good planet that can help us acquire what we need. And it doesn't necessarily have to be physical acquisition of stuff, though it can be for, financial gain or financial resources. It doesn't have to be specifically for that. It can be for immaterial things. It can be for, things like peace of mind, or for a promotion, or for some kind of career opportunity, or it can even be for a relationship. So very, very broad powers here to bring about something important or useful to us. So taking a look at our first example here from the North American version of this chart, this takes place at May 14th at around 7:30 a.m. And this is just a few hours later after the Jupiter election. All we've done is kind of move Jupiter to the MC and the moon to the ascendant. And so because of that, because we've made the moon more angular here, we have kind of clicked more into the 7th Lunar Mansion energy. So at our election here, like I said, we have the moon on the ascendant, and she's still applying that trine to Jupiter that we talked about. It's now a little bit closer because several hours have passed. The moon is not afflicted by Mars or Saturn. The ruler of the first house is Mercury, who here is placed in the 12th house when we have the moon very angular. And I do not actually prefer this. I don't really like it when the ruler of the first is in the 12th house. But what you can do is, if you kind of agree with me, I wanted to show the election kind of as like a standard election first. But if you similarly do not like that with Mercury in the more in the 12th house, you can actually back the election up to closer to 7 a.m. If you would like, which puts Mercury more squarely on the ascendant and not averse to it, or not cadent from it, I guess, not averse to it. The only other kind of thing that I would kind of say may be distasteful for some is that Mercury is conjoined the North Node here, and depending on your relationship between planetary and node configurations, whether or not you're comfortable with that or like that, you may decide to pass on this election. I tend to think it's fine if it's not the sun and the moon. The Australian version of this chart takes place on May 15th at around 10 a.m., kind of still just like the North American version, just a few hours after the Jupiter election. And here we have the moon conjoined the ascendant in the 7th lunar mansion, applying that trine to Jupiter, which is now very, very tight, less than a degree apart. The ruler of the first house is Mercury here, still placed in the 12th, still conjoined the North Node, just like in the North American version. And here you can also back the ascendant up if you would like to put Mercury more squarely on the ascendant. So instead of that time that I first mentioned, if you would prefer, you can do more of like a 9:15 kind of chart if you would prefer. The only kind of thing that I do not prefer in this, like if we do this, one thing that we can't really avoid is Mars here in the first house, and I don't really prefer it when malefics are in the first house, so that might be something to consider, or something to switch the whole sign or equal houses for, to where you don't have to worry about it. And then finally, the Western European version of this chart, very, very similar. The moon conjoined the ascendant here in the first house. I'm applying that trine with Jupiter, which has tightened up a little bit. Before, when it was the Jupiter talisman election potential, it was like 12 degrees. Now we're about 10 degrees apart, so we've tightened up some. But the ruler of the first house is still Mercury. I went ahead and took this one for May 14th at around 6:30, with Mercury more on the ascendant than initially, and we don't have to worry about the first house in this is very small, so we don't really have to worry about Mars. Mars is now in the second house, which might make it not make it a difficult talisman for financial acquisition because of Mars here, and the same with the North American version, which also had Mars in the first. That might make it more difficult. The thing that we have to balance here in the Western European version is that we have Saturn very angular here on the midheaven, which we didn't really have in the other versions. So that might also cause hindrances if you wanted to use this talisman for like career goals, promotion or career opportunities, because Saturn energy is kind of sitting in this house. But what you can do is, if you don't super care about Mercury being that angular, then you can advance it some to get Saturn off the midheaven more, or pull it back. But I guess to pull it back, you have to pull it back pretty far. So I probably would more prefer the pushing it forward if you needed to. So our third electional opportunity for this 2-week period is going to be for a Sirius fixed star talisman. And Sirius is an interesting talisman to have. It's primarily written about as being able to, get honor and goodwill from somebody, particularly somebody in a position of authority, which is not an uncommon characteristic for a lot of the fixed star Lunar Mansion talismans. A lot of them are about like kind of impressing people in high society, more or less. But in today's world, while that is still a thing, I think of it primarily as like a networking star. It is a star that you can use to like get noticed by somebody who may be a little bit more well known in your field than you. Basically, a good way to get some good press or good social proof about you. It is also talked about as having power over the spirits of the air, which is kind of an interesting thing to describe. So primarily you could say that Sirius is used as potentially a weather influencing talisman, or anything that might have to do with the air itself. And then of course there is kind of like the interesting idea of being able to communicate more strongly with spirits that are associated with a particular one of the 4 fundamental elements of the world, and what that might mean as far as like powers of creation, I guess. And then, where the stars of fire, water, and earth, Captain Planet, might be. All in all, I think Sirius is a pretty positive star to have around, especially since it is also talked about as having the power to repair relationships, which might be something to look into if you're somebody who's kind of estranged or, cut off in some ways from those around you. Taking a look at our elections for the Sirius talismans, the North American version of this chart takes place on May 15th at around 4 o'clock. This chart is set for 3:52 p.m., 15:52. And here we have the moon applying, well, here we have the fixed star on the midheaven with the moon applying a conjunction to it, along with Mars. While Venus is the ruler of the first house, placed here in Gemini, far enough from the sun to not be combust, not square Saturn, not afflicted by Mars either. And this is another one of those ones where the ruler of the first house is close to the north node. So if you're uncomfortable with kind of node planetary connections, then you don't proceed with this one. Like I said, I tend to not worry about them unless it's the sun or moon specifically. And this conjunction with Mars here is what we are looking for, because Sirius is described as being of the nature of Mars and Jupiter. So the star has its own kind of like martial undertones to it, which we can pull out and kind of resonate with more strongly by including Mars very strongly in the chart for the election itself. So we include that Mars on the midheaven, the moon applies to it, and we kind of like dig out that nature, that power of this star. Western Europe does not have a Sirius star election opportunity, but Australia does. And here we've taken that Moon-Mars conjunction from the midheaven, like it was in the North American version, and we've slapped it on the ascendant here. The moon moves to the conjunction of Mars, which is one of the planets that Sirius is said to be of the nature of, while the star rises over the ascendant. And this one is a little bit different because before we were talking about Venus as the ruler of the first house and, needing to take care of Venus or watch out for Venus and whether or not her position next to a node is something that people would not really want to work with, which is fine. And here for Australia, we don't have to worry about that because Cancer is on the ascendant, which means that we focus on the moon now as the ruler of the first house. So we just make sure that the moon is not afflicted by a planet that is by a malevolent planet like Mars or Saturn. And while we would normally think of a Mars conjunction as an affliction to the moon, because Mars is the planet that we are wanting to connect to, because it is a planet that is of the nature of the star that we're working with, then it's not considered an affliction in this case because we want this now. Like we want to deal with this now. So the next election that we're going to talk about is for the 10th Lunar Mansion. And the 10th Lunar Mansion is another one of my favorites, so this is kind of a fun week for me. But the 10th Lunar Mansion is one that is primarily about strength and healing. And there are a number of lunar mansions that are about healing, and each one kind of has their own different kind of modality or kind of method of healing that they are best suited for. And the 10th Lunar Mansion is really more about preventative medicine and strengthening the body, kind of making it, bolstering the immune system, strengthening the Wei Qi of an individual, and helping with that kind of preventative, keeping one from being ill. It also helps very much for people who are recovering from an illness, like recently healed or kind of recently overcome an illness, but are still kind of like in that vulnerable, weak period where they're not still at like 100%, but they're not sick yet, or they're not sick anymore. The 10th Lunar Mansion is good for recovery. So this, of course, can be utilized for somebody who is going into surgery to help them more quickly recover from the surgery, get their strength back in whatever capacity that might mean for them. It is not super great for healing an illness directly, but it does this kind of indirectly in that it tends to have what I've noticed most is that it tends to have this weird effect on the physician themselves, to where it kind of like orchestrates events to where the patient gets the best doctor that, gets like the doctor they need to help them the most with whatever situation they're working with. So this can be really great from like a patient advocacy kind of standpoint. Like if you're an individual who kind of struggles to have doctors understand them or constantly feels like they don't fit, like they don't mesh well with different doctors that they encounter, then the 10th Lunar Mansion might be a really great opportunity to help explore and find a good physician fit for you, especially if you're in one of those communities or demographics that tend to be not believed as much about illnesses or pain that they may be experiencing. Definitely recommend getting this. So there have just been a lot of different instances for individuals who have utilized this talisman, either because I recommended it to them or they picked up their own, to where there's a situation to where like their normal doctor's not available, so they get somebody else, but that ends up being a really great fit, helps them out a lot, and they end up kind of switching, assuming that's possible and it's not just like a traveling doctor who just kind of like fills in. Or it's also manifested in instances where a doctor has kind of like tried something a little bit more unorthodox, which has ended up being kind of like the silver bullet to the situation. So I really enjoy the 10th Lunar Mansion. Definitely recommend it to anybody who might be in one of those situations where they could utilize it. And so this election is not what I would call the best 10th Lunar Mansion election. There have been better ones in the past, of course, and there will be better ones in the future. But this is probably like our first really good one, our first acceptable one, I guess we could say. Now that the 10th Lunar Mansion has moved more into the waxing half of the zodiac. Well, we still have a little bit left of it here, I guess. So our first election is for actually the North American continent. And here we have the moon in the 10th Lunar Mansion conjoined the ascendant. The sun is the ruler of the first house here in Taurus. We're now past that square of Saturn that did not see in the past video. So we don't have to worry about that. We also don't have to worry about Mars, and we're far enough away from the node to not have to worry about that at this time as well. The moon here is applying actually a sextile to Venus. Venus is a benefic planet, and Venus has that power to heal and mend in a way that only benefic planets really can. What makes this not a super ideal 10th Lunar Mansion talisman, one that I would really kind of bank on, is that the moon is technically moving towards this opposition of Saturn. It's about 12 degrees away, so still pretty far, and we have to go through the sextile of Venus first, most immediately. So I don't see it as too much of an issue, but maybe something that you're uncomfortable with. And I tend to recommend being a bit more cautious with your talismans that tend to be about health of the body, especially for those individuals who would probably be a neater fit for the 10th Lunar Mansion. Those who are, those who want to be stronger, those who may be weakened due to an illness or recovering from something. You kind of don't want to, poke that bear if there might be an issue. Thank you, Lee. Western Europe also has an option for the 10th Lunar Mansion, while Australia does not. And here it's very similar, the moon in the 10th Lunar Mansion on the ascendant here. But in this instance, we have the moon as the ruler of the first house instead of the sun. And here the moon has just separated the sextile from the sun, which would have been really cool, and is now applying the sextile to Venus. We kind of still have that same thing happening, but now it's kind of less of a danger. So I like the Western European version of this chart a little bit more. Because the moon, while the moon is still technically applying this opposition to Saturn, there's more space between it. It's now like 15, 16 degrees distant. So we have a lot more breathing room here, but still something to consider that, this opposition to Saturn is still something that the moon has to do. So still might not be something that you feel super comfortable with. Totally fine. So the next election that we're going to talk about is the 16th Lunar Mansion. And the 16th Lunar Mansion is a pretty good one. It is primarily one that is about buying and selling. More about like the selling, kind of like making money from selling, more like the commerce aspect of it. So I really recommend the 16th Lunar Mansion for people who, of course, are in a goods-oriented business. It can also be used for service-oriented business. I'm not saying that it can't, but it just sort of like more easily leans into that like transaction of goods, that exchange of goods. But like I said, it can be tweaked, of course, to be more service oriented. As long as we kind of have that transaction, it's more about making money and kind of like accumulating wealth or making one's business successful. So if you are the proprietor of a business, definitely recommend getting a 16th Lunar Mansion talisman, especially a really good one. And this can actually be a decent one that you might decide to look into a little bit more. There are a couple of things that might make it a little bit more iffy, and we will talk about that. Taking a look at the Western European version of this chart, we have the moon placed here in the 16th Lunar Mansion on the ascendant, with Venus as the ruler of the first house, here placed in Gemini, separating from that node if that is something that you were more concerned with before. And at this time, the moon is applying a trine to Mercury, who is very strong in Gemini. And I really like this, of course, because Mercury is a planet that is naturally associated with commerce, exchange, that kind of thing. So it fits in very well with 16th Lunar Mansion energy. Oh, another thing, the 16th Lunar Mansion can also be very good for individuals who have like a thing that they're trying to sell. Like even if you're not in a business per se, and you aren't somebody who is, trying to sell goods or services, maybe you're somebody who's just trying to like sell a house or sell a car or kind of something like that. Something like you're struggling to kind of get rid of something or kind of exchange something for money. The 16th Lunar Mansion can help you potentially find a buyer for that. So not only is it useful for people who have, businesses that are more specifically focused on selling goods, whether that is in person or online or both. It can also be very useful for people who just kind of have like a one-off thing that they need to unload. The only thing that is potentially not great about this chart is this Mars square. To the ascendant, what the heck is that? Is it this Mars square to the, okay, it's better. And this can be something that you kind of change depending on exactly how you feel about aspects to the ascendant. For myself, I give aspects to the ascendant about 5 degrees orb. So this is fine. This chart right here is fine because we are beyond that 5 degree, just a little bit beyond that 5 degree mark. So I don't consider Mars in a square aspect to the ascendant here. But if you are somebody who prefers a little bit more width, a little bit more of a gap between the ascendant and malefic aspects, that's totally fine. You can make this a little bit later. Just make sure that you don't go into the Scorpio ascendant, because then the moon will be way too cadent. But if you prefer, you can push the ascendant back to be like 25, 26, 27 degrees to get that Mars square further away from the ascendant. That's totally fine. Our next election is for a 17th Lunar Mansion talisman. And the 17th Lunar Mansion is one that I don't think I've had the opportunity to talk about either before or in a very, very long time. And the 17th Lunar Mansion kind of picks up where the 16th Lunar Mansion that we just talked about left off. The 16th Lunar Mansion is more about making money, and the 17th Lunar Mansion is more about protecting it. Not exactly within the same kind of modality, we'll say, as like Deneb Al-Jidi, which is more about like protection and investment, like protection of an investment. The 17th Lunar Mansion, Al-Iqlil, is more about protection of wealth or objects, valuable objects, from theft or embezzlement or loss, things like that. It's more of like I guess the insurance talisman might be a way to put it. So if you are an individual who worries about things like that, or has been through something like that in the past and of course doesn't want to repeat it, then 17th Lunar Mansion talismans are a great way to keep that from happening or to protect against that. It can also be used for individuals who like for protection from home invasion or like break-ins, burglaries, by keeping them in the home. It can be useful for like the protection, like nowadays, really the big issue is like identity theft, right? So it can actually be very useful for protection from identity theft as well. And it just kind of depends on where you keep it and how you keep it. For like protection of the home from burglary, obviously like keep one under the welcome mat, either outside or immediately inside. Protection of finances from theft or anything like that, it's best to keep it with like financial documents. For protection from, of course, identity theft, it's good to keep it with things like birth certificates and social security cards, copies of those that are likely kept in the filing cabinet in the home for some in many cases, maybe along with the financial information, so you can probably protect both at the same time. Or to protect one's vehicle, keep it in the vehicle. There's a lot that you can do there's a lot you can do with the 17th Lunar Mansion to shield assets or to shield money or things that you don't want to get out. But remember, it's mostly from like theft and loss is what we're aiming for here. Looking at our election here for the North American version of this chart, it's going to be on May 23rd at around 1630. And here we have the moon in the first house in the 17th Lunar Mansion. And in this chart, she is applying the trine to Jupiter down here in Pisces. And I really like Jupiter as like a protector in this instance, especially because one of Jupiter's main powers is to stabilize. And protecting assets and protecting the home and vehicles and identity is a very stabilizing thing, because when those things are removed, when those things are taken, obviously life kind of like gets a little bit more crazy, a little bit more turbulent, we'll say. So you have to kind of repair that situation, kind of figure out what went wrong, close everything down, blah blah blah. So I really like Jupiter here as a protector in this case, which I think is really great. We don't have to worry about this stupid Mars square now. We don't have to worry about this stupid Saturn square. The ruler of the first house in this instance is Venus here. Again, we're kind of separating from that node, don't have to worry about it, separating from the sun, not afflicted by Mars or Saturn. So overall, the ruler of the first house is good, the moon is good, everything's good. Western Europe's version of this chart is very similar. We've just moved the moon to the midheaven in this 17th Lunar Mansion, and here she is applying that same trine to Jupiter here in the second house, which is pretty neat, since we're dealing primarily with finances. And Jupiter rules the first house in this chart, and again, unafflicted by Mars or Saturn, as is the moon. Australia does not have an opportunity for this chart, and that is because by the time the moon comes around again to be angular, when she's in the 17th Lunar Mansion, she's actually applying the square to Saturn, and we can't do that. That's no good. So our next election chart is actually very interesting, and I wanted to talk a bit about it. And this is exclusively for the Western European continent, so like exclusive Western European content here. And they just get like a really interesting situation that is a little bit enviable. So to kind of give some context to this, there are two different Bohemian fixed stars that are projected onto the ecliptic at around 24 degrees of Libra. One is Spica, who is the more famous one, and the second is Arcturus, who I think is who's definitely overshadowed by Spica, but I think it just is amazing. And what changes, when we're talking about elections for fixed stars, we want the moon to be conjoining the fixed star on the ascendant or the midheaven. And so that means that when we're making elections for Spica or Arcturus, it can technically be for both. And what changes it, what changes the flavor of the election to be more Arcturian or more Spican, is the planet that the moon is immediately applying to, because that changes who we're more open to. That kind of changes which stellar gate is open, basically. And Western Europe actually has an opportunity for either or for both, which I think is very, very fascinating. And all you have to do is wait a few minutes. So let's talk a bit about these stars and what they're good for before we dive into the elections themselves. And it's actually kind of interesting because I think, in my experience, they have a really interesting like synergistic power to help the body, like to help an individual. Spica is often associated with like art and music, and can be very useful for people who are on that trajectory, who are interested in exploring those fields or involved in those fields. Excellent use for more like a muse talisman, I guess you could say. It also is associated with the accumulation of wealth, because you have that harvest aspect of it, with being associated with the ear of corn or wheat, agricultural stuff. So it can be very useful for people who are trying to escape from poverty. And it also has associations with litigation, with being successful or protected from lawsuits. So very useful in those regards as well. But it also has this sort of like really interesting power, I found, to help kind of like assuage the mind. So if you're an individual who suffers from like post-traumatic stress disorder of any kind at all, or otherwise struggles with like some sort of emotional disorder, Spica is an amazing help for you. So if you are anybody who struggles with any kind of situation like that, Spica can help kind of like really gain a sense of calm and composure, and like not only that, but like a sense of safety, to be able to kind of like fully process whatever is triggering you in like a very real PTSD type context. From those kinds of episodes really help you move on. I find it especially helpful for like women and children who have been in abusive households and are escaping or anything like that, or even for people who have like suffered with alcoholism in the past. Spica is very great to help with. Arcturus, on the other hand, is a bit more focused on the body. It is primarily described as being the star that is associated with the sanguine humor, and so it's a star that is associated with the blood. So this could be an individual, like Arcturus talismans are really helpful for individuals who are maybe struggling with a blood disorder in any kind or any kind of regard. Arcturus is very helpful for that. It can also be very useful for an individual who is very strongly melancholic and wants to kind of like get more sanguine energy into their body or their personality to kind of overcome a lot of the shortfalls that the melancholic humor can develop. So like for people who struggle with depression, the Arcturus can be very useful for, or any sort of like pessimism or anything like that. Anybody who is just kind of like down in the dumps, general malaise, that kind of thing. Arcturus is very helpful for, because it strengthens this sanguine temperament or humor in the body. And even if you're somebody who struggles with a lot of melancholic physical complaints like constipation or arthritis or autoimmune disorders, things like that, Arcturus can be very helpful for, because again, we're bolstering that sanguine energy. So what makes this election here very fascinating for May 23rd at 1657 is that, well, let's just kind of break it down. So on our ascendant, we have 24 degrees of Libra rising. So we have both Arcturus and Spica, basically, their projected ecliptical degrees on the ascendant at the same time, which is not uncommon. Obviously, it happens every time because that's the degree that they are in. The moon is applying the aspect to the conjunction immediately to this degree on the ascendant, which is great. And at this specific moment in time, at 1657, she's applying this trine to Mercury very, very tightly. You see 23 Libra in 9 minutes and 23 Gemini in 10 minutes. So very, very tightly. And this is the moment for the Spica talisman to happen. Like the few minutes before this, when the moon is applying this sextile or this trine, I'm sorry, to Mercury, because Spica is said to be of the nature of Mercury and Venus. So because the moon is applying to Mercury, we're more tapped into that Spica energy. The Spica gate is open, we'll say, and the Arcturus gate is closed. But if we wait just a couple minutes later at 1700, Mercury, the moon is now separating from this trine of Mercury. You can see we're 23 Libra and 11, and 23 Gemini and 10. So we're done with that. We've separated it from for 1 minute, or by 1 minute. And now the moon is applying the trine to Jupiter. And this is now the Arcturus talisman, as Arcturus is said to be of the nature of Jupiter and Mars. So if the moon is at 24 degrees Libra and we're applying to either Venus or Mercury, that's Spica energy. But if the moon is at this degree and we're applying either to Jupiter or Mars, that is Arcturus energy. So this, I think, is very fascinating, and I wish, honestly, that I was at this location when it happened, so that I could kind of experiment with this for like a whole body, like mind, like body and soul type healing talisman, because I just think there's a lot of very interesting potential in this talismanic combination. The only thing that we kind of have to watch out for is this Mars square to the ascendant that we kind of have going through mid Libra right now. While I think that this 6-degree distance is fine, others may not. So kind of, weigh how you feel with that. But I think that this opportunity is really, really cool, and a little bit too cool to pass up. Unfortunately, North America will not have an opportunity for this because, as you can see, the moon at around 24 degrees Libra is in the middle of the third house, which is not doing anybody any favors because she needs to be on the ascendant or the midheaven while she is applying to the star. And Australia will also not have an opportunity for this, for either the Spica or the Arcturus talisman, because while at the time we can get the moon to apply to Spica on an angle, like right now, on May 23rd at 21:44, and we can get the trine to Mercury, which would make it more of a Spica talisman. At the same time, we would have to deal with a retrograde ruler of the first house and Saturn in the first house, and I'm not going to mess with that. So those were all the electional opportunities that I had to share with you guys for this 2-week period leading up to our Sagittarius Lunar Eclipse. A lot going on. Western Europe especially has some very fascinating and very unique electional opportunities, so I really hope you guys capitalize on them while we can, because we don't get situations like this all the time. Australia kind of got the short end of the stick on this one, mostly, and that tends to happen mostly due to the kind of the gap in the moon degrees. The moon tends to be a little bit further on in Australian charts, set for kind of the same time or the same thing. So they either kind of miss out or have kind of their own unique opportunities. So unfortunately, Australia didn't have a whole lot this time around. But all that may change after our Sagittarius Lunar Eclipse and for the electional opportunities that we have then. So everybody take care, be safe during eclipse season coming up very shortly. And I will see everyone again on the Sagittarius Eclipse.